is one of the largest protests we have seen in years. Toronto and in cities across Canada, women and in the world took to the streets to send a message to U.S. President Donald Trump on his very first full day in office. Thousands took part in the march here, marking their voices and making them heard all the way to Washington. Good evening. Officially, it wasn't an anti-Trump protest, but there is no doubt that the U.S. president is the reason that women were marching today.
They wanted to show support for women's rights, hoping to send a message to politicians on both sides of the border. CTV's Janice Golding is covering the Toronto march for us. And Janice, the women also wanted to make it clear today that Trump-style policies are not welcome here in Canada. Janice.
Andrea, there were hundreds of protests and demonstrations in the U.S. today, some 600 in fact. And here in Canada, thousands joined their voices to the chorus with 30 events across our country. The biggest, of course, taking place right here in Toronto. Take a look.
Are we ready to say no to hate and yes to love?
It was a rallying cry that rang out across Queen's Park.
We want you to know you are part of history right now. Yeah!
Tens of thousands gathered at the seat of our provincial government to decry the state of the government south of the border.
I think the point was seeing not only what was happening in the States during the presidential election, but how that gave rise to bigotry and prejudice and hate right here in Toronto and then across Ontario.
Women's equality under attack. What do we do? Stand up, fight back.
And then they took to the streets. The Women's March on Washington, Toronto, completely shutting down University Avenue.
Who's got the power? We've got the power!
People of every walk of life united in their opposition against U.S. President Donald Trump.
I think that Trump is, what he represents is so repulsive to me.
To see a person in such a position of power who continues to talk about groping women, degrading women, is really disheartening.
I'm not okay with what Trump represents, and we need to make sure everyone knows that we as women, we as Muslim women, women of color, are not going to stay silent about it.
They bore signs like evolve and respect. They also carried with them their fears about what a Donald Trump presidency will mean across the border and for the world.
Women have rights, and we need to protect them. No matter where our sisters are in the world, we need to stand in solidarity.
The worldwide backlash, evidenced by marches such as these, all harbingers of the resistance Trump may face in office.
Obviously, the election of Donald Trump has brought us all together, but I think as we've come together, we realize there's a lot of work to do in Toronto.
The huge turnout today, also an indication of what many Torontonians won't stand for here at home. So just how big was this march? Well, organizers tell us they estimate about 60,000 people turned out today, although we have no real way of verifying that. Now, the protests that took place in Canada number just a few among those that have taken place across the globe on all 7 continents. Reporting live, I'm Janice Golding. Now back to Colin.
Thank you, Janice. The Toronto March and others around the world were in solidarity with the one in Washington, D.C., where an estimated 500,000 people turned out. They rallied as Trump made his visit to the CIA today, one of his first stops as president. CTV's Tom Walters reports.
This girl is on fire.
A fire of emotion, a flood of people, and a message.
We are not afraid of Donald Trump.
With many wearing hats that suggest pussycat ears, they came to grab the attention of a president who has joked about sexual assault.
Women's March! DC!
And with the star power of Madonna to push back against what they see as an agenda of hate.
We choose love.
And a threat to racial and religious minorities and women.
This is the moment of the beginning of the revival of the women's movement.
The Women's March on Washington drew hundreds of thousands. So many people that most were blocks away from the speakers. So many people they had to reroute the march because they had filled up their entire route with worried Americans and some Canadians.
I think it's relevant to all women all over the world.
Among them, U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth, a double amputee because of war wounds suffered while serving as a soldier in Iraq.
I didn't shed blood to defend this nation. I didn't give up literally parts of my body to have the Constitution trampled on.
Tom Walters, CTV News, Washington.
And CTV's Richard Madden joins us now from Washington. Richard, you were on the ground during those marches. What were some of the motivations for the people coming out there, and especially such large numbers?
Well, it was originally a call to action after Donald Trump's upset victory. It's supposed to promote diversity and equality, but it quickly turned into a large anti-Trump protest. And as Tom mentioned in his piece, it literally filled the downtown core. The streets were so clogged they had to reroute the march and it couldn't go to the White House. It was a really stunning thing to see. Remember, this is Donald Trump's first full day as president, and this is what he would look out, from the White House. It was unbelievable. But many of the marchers wore the pink hats. They used a lot of Donald Trump's derogatory words against women against him, and there were a lot of colorful, almost carnival-like displays. And a complete contrast to what we saw yesterday when we saw protests in the streets, police clashing with protesters, the riot gear, pepper spray, a really different vibe. However, the population completely swelled, 500,000 people.
And we know the U.S. president loves to comment on people who do comment on him. Have we heard anything from him, his reaction to these protests, these demonstrations, or are we expecting to hear something from him in the days to come?
I suspect he will reach out at some point, whether it's on Twitter or whether it's his new press secretary, Sean Spicer. Trump has been consumed with attacking the media over what he called their unfair treatment, his supposed tiff with the CIA, which is completely wrong. But Donald Trump does not take criticism, as we know. We can likely expect to hear something from the new president in the next few days. But as for the protesters who are here, they are insisting they're going to stay engaged, they're going to keep staying active. And they want to do everything they can to challenge the new president, but they have 4 long years.
And they'll keep those challenges up for the next 4, I'm sure. Richard Madden in the American Capitol. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, thanks, Colin.
Here's a look at one of the other women's marches that took place on this side of the border today. Crowds gathered in downtown Ottawa. More than 3,500 people took part in the nation's capital, surpassing organizers' expectations. And take a look at the massive crowds in Chicago. So many people turned out for the Women's March there. Organizers had to cancel the actual march portion of the event due to safety concerns. Instead, they extended the rally and opened up overflow areas to accommodate everyone who showed up. And overseas, tens of thousands of people supporting the Women's March movement took to the streets of London. Protesters gathered outside the U.S. Embassy to promote women's rights and denounce sexism and misogyny in the U.S. and around the world.